Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. Today we are looking at the latest Total War game from Creative Assembly, Total War Three Kingdoms. Three Kingdoms is set in late 2nd century and early to mid-3rd century China, an era known for the final decline of the great Han Dynasty and the political shifts that followed. The period is a frequent theme in East Asian popular culture and inspired Luo Guanzhong's Romance of the Three Kingdoms, one of the most famous novels in Chinese literature dating back to the early 16th century. With me to discuss the game is Maggie Greene. Maggie is Assistant Professor of Modern Chinese History and East Asian Cultural History at Montana State and the author of Resisting Spirits, Drama Reform and Cultural Transformation in the People's Republic of China, available later this summer. Maggie was actually the first person I thought of as I was playing Total War Three Kingdoms, and I'm really happy she's available to do it. Maggie, thanks a million for being here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me on.
The Total War series is this very kind of long-running series, and I'll come out and just say it, I get a little bit nervous with games like this on History Respawn because people who are into these games are really into them. And for those of you watching and listening, I love you and I'm glad you're here. That's not meant as in a bad way. It's just meant that, for example, if this video episode includes footage of my attempts to take the city of Luoyang, it's going to be, people who actually know how these games work will be horrified. So you have to bear with us. Because we're really interested in the context. And of course, the context of the game is all about, the Three Kingdoms period, which is kind of a broad way to say it. So, Maggie, as our expert guest today, would you mind sharing with the audience a little bit, what is this context, this Three Kingdoms context, and not even just, the historical reality of late 20th century China, the very end of the Han, but also, this is a period in Chinese history which has really lent itself to a lot of stylistic and thematic interpretation over the centuries.
Yes.
And so you're more than welcome to get into that in a big way too.
So, as you mentioned, this period, of course, is the basis for one of the four, vernacular novels of classical Chinese literature, Sanguo Yanyi, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which has provided so much fodder for not just Chinese adaptation, but in East Asia more broadly, as well as, of course, as we can see, even into the West. But this has proved, I think, like other kind of relatively traumatic periods of Chinese history. In my own research, it's actually the late Southern Song Dynasty, which has some sort of similar issues going on. There's a lot of turmoil. You've got things sort of breaking apart. The society is not what it should be. And it's proved to be really rich fodder for cultural workers, throughout the ages. I shouldn't call them that. That's a very socialist term, isn't it?
Okay.
But regardless, for writers and artists in particular, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms is something that continues to really capture people's imaginations. It's something that I actually don't know that much about. I will shamefacedly admit I've never actually read Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but it is the way that it appears in literature and in theater and gets excerpted, and all these characters that are larger than life have been really embedded, I think, into cultural memory. Like, even though I've never read Romance of the Three Kingdoms, like, I know enough to be like, oh yeah, it's Cao Cao or Liu Bei or whoever. Like, the names, I'm like, oh yeah, that person did something. And I have a vague idea about the kind of person that they were, or the ways in which they've been presented, if that makes any sense.
No, definitely. I was just going to say, if you spend any time in East Asia and even in parts of Southeast Asia with large Chinese communities, like if you're watching TV in Malaysia or the Philippines and stuff like that, you don't even have to read the book to have a rough idea who the main cast members are,
Right.
Zhuge Liang and all this kind of stuff. And
the Battle of Red Cliff.
Right.
You're like, oh yeah, Chibi. Yes, okay. Something happened there. It was a battle near a Red Cliff. But yeah, it's so much a part of, even just ignoring the book itself and various adaptations, those stories have just really embedded themselves in a lot of ways, even just in the way that people talk about certain issues, which is pretty interesting.
Right, and so it's such an interesting idea, of course, because it's so densely kind of packed with it opens with the Han Dynasty still exists, the Han Empire, but its days are numbered, and of course we the audience know the days are extremely numbered and about to go, and the Han, I tell my students, this is way back when well, not that far back, maybe a century ago, you had Western historians who'd openly compare the Han to the Roman Empire and stuff like this, right? It's like that. Like I feel like, isn't this kind of story almost about like the loss of something special as much as anything else?
Yeah, I can see that. I actually also skip over the Han in my teaching when I have to do pre-modern. Yeah, I tend to be very much like, okay, we're going to talk about Confucius. Now moving forward to the Tang Dynasty. Some stuff happened. Don't worry about it. China was unified.
Oh,
But yeah.
moving through. Oh, well, I teach world history, and people who listen to the podcast regularly will know because I bring it up all the time. And when you teach world history, it's like, okay, we're doing China today, guys, and there's these 5 dynasties. Here they are, and these are the five
Yeah,
that I would take note of. And Han is the first one. And in the game and in the kind of the period, so it's the end of the Han, and the game I think conveys fairly well. This has been a stable government for a long time, or for a long time. The Han had lasted, although actual Han scholars would come and spank me for saying this, but it lasts about 400 years. There's lots of sub periods.
It was a good long run.
It was a good run.
And it was a good long run.
And the game and the kind of the years that follow are sometimes called the period of division and all this kind of stuff. And so you have kind of, it's so the early 3rd century is when the Han kind of definitely kind of disappears, and then you have the Tang kind of emerge in the very, very early 7th, immediately preceded by another one. And I'm sorry audience, I'm trying not to become a super China nerd while disguising my shameless lack of knowledge about Imperial Chinese history. So there's really kind of this is the fall of something dramatic, and the intro cinematic to the game, the tyrannical Dongzhuo, and there's this very clear this was a good government and it's being brought down by weak men and self-interest.
And a big baddie.
And a big baddie, right. Right, but that feeds into the themes you were talking about Confucianism a minute ago. Like, this is real. Yep. All this stuff goes together, right? These
yes.
Like, for especially people who have like close to no idea, you and I are kind of talking here. Oh, and of course, Confucian principles are involved in this, but how are they?
Yeah, so I mean, if we're thinking about, so one thing that I always have to remind my students, and one reason that I always, no matter what class I'm teaching, I always at least have my sort of like 1 week, like everything you need to know about East Asia, intro to stuff. Well, and it's obviously not everything that they need to know, but it's like East Asia 101. But I do always have Confucianism 101, because I think one thing that people easily forget in the West, partially because of the way that Confucianism is talked about, but Confucianism is, above all other things, okay, we can talk about Neo-Confucianism and the Song Dynasty later, I suppose, but it's a ruling technology, right? Mm-hmm. It's all about how do we make sense of this world that in Confucius's era and at the end of the Han Dynasty and at various periods in Chinese history is actually quite chaotic. And of course, in Confucianism, the idea is that the ruler himself needs to be principled and doing everything that he needs to be doing in a good moral sense. That should be reflected in his relationships to his ministers, but that kind of relationship should also be reflected in things like the family, on an individual level. So the idea that any moral failings of leaders or want to be leaders is, of course, going to, impact whatever's going on in terms of, how the country is functioning, is really, really important. And especially when you combine that with the mandate of heaven, right? So the idea that the mandate of heaven basically says that, yes, the ruler has some sort of divine blessing, I suppose, in a sense, but they can lose that. So if like everything is going wrong, that clearly means that the leader has lost the mandate of heaven. I compare it, most of my students, when they think about monarchies and emperors and stuff. They think about, Europe circa the 15th century or something, and divine right of kings. Mm-hmm. And the mandate of heaven is different, though. That idea underpinning Chinese dynasties is, I think, functionally quite different, because if things are really going wrong, that means that you as a leader have clearly screwed up, and that opens the door for somebody else to come in and then claim the mandate.
So in Total War Three Kingdoms, it's quite interesting. So Cao Cao, who's actually presented to you as quote-unquote the easy campaign, so it's basically prodding you towards him. Just use this guy first, So if you're, you learn the ropes with this guy. So you're going to be spending time with him. He's very wily and very diplomatic, and even as a resource you can use that refills slowly over time to incite proxy wars and kind of turn people against each other and everything else. But he's not, he's not a bad guy. Whereas I've often seen him depicted as a bad guy. And then Liu Bei, who's kind of nominally an ally of yours, but kind of not. The game very cleverly kind of begins just as an alliance has collapsed, and you can rebuild it if you want. And Liu Bei is almost like, teacher's pet, like, I'm in this for China. And like all his like barks, all his little audio clips are like, oh, China must come together. And he's he's such a manifestation of like, a correct Confucian kind of approach to this. Whereas Cao Cao is much more complicated. Now, Cao Cao is, as in particular, both those characters, or both those people, they lived. But you see what I'm doing now already. I'm getting mixed up between figures and characters. Talk to you about these two. Talk to you about these two figures. Like I said, I'm having trouble even distinguishing between fictional characters and historical figures.
So I mentioned, but since I've never played Total War, and it's really usually if it was something more in my wheelhouse, I would have ponied up the money and downloaded the game. But like, I just know that tactical strategy war, it is just not my thing. Again, the parts of the game that looked like Crusader Kings 2 was like very enjoyable. I was like, that looks really fun. And then the battle sequence started, and I was just like, oh no. But one of the most interesting things, so I talked to two friends of mine who both play the game. One of them has only sort of dabbled in it. I think he only played like one full campaign. The other one had spent quite a lot more time with it, and both of them really, really like the game. But the latter person, he said that one of the most interesting things that he heard was that when the developers were talking to Western audiences and Western, the Western media and stuff about the game, and the split between the romance and the records, people in the West were like, what? Why are you doing that? We don't understand. But when they talked to Chinese audiences, like Chinese journalists and stuff were like, why did you do that? What's the difference? Which I think is really interesting, because to me, that's an explicit acknowledgement of the overlap. Like, yes, we have the records of the Three Kingdoms, and we have Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but at this point the two are so completely intertwined, at least in the Chinese, like, I don't want to say the Chinese mind, but like culturally they're so intertwined that like what to Westerners looked really weird, looked really weird to Chinese audiences, but for a completely different reason, which I thought was really cool.
Right, is it kind of like yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh no, I thought it was really interesting. And my friend said that he sort of felt like that was some kind of idea in terms of Western audiences, at least when the developers were talking to players and talking to journalists, having some sort of belief in the quote unquote objective truth of history, versus recognizing that this is a really it's a constructed history, that even the records of the Three Kingdoms were written later, and then of course Romance of the Three Kingdoms has just built on top of that, and that's morphed and changed over the centuries. So like, I don't know, I just thought that was a really interesting point, because I can't think of too many games where we get to go, okay, well, what was the like sort of Chinese reaction to this, for a variety of reasons, and especially when it's something based in China.
Right, there's a reason we have honest, brave, suspiciously handsome heroes, and
yes,
the great beauties of Chinese history, and all these
Exactly.
and they're epic in the true sense, right? And Total War games, in my opinion, are great when they're epic. I'm fascinated that they went from like going back to Rome and Attila the Hun and things like this. They went off and did Warhammer and just completely let their freak flag fly, right? And just went bananas. And then they come back to China, but then they come back also to they embrace an epic way of telling the story,
which is really
allows,
cool.
which is really cool, and just creates this
Now,
fun experience, you know.
I think it's really awesome. I mean, one of the things that constantly irks me as a Chinese historian, so you know, I play games, and my students know that, and I have like video game art and stuff in my office. I also have a Final Fantasy X logo that I cross-stitched many years ago, which often sets my students at ease, because like they literally walk into my office and it's like, oh, okay, like she knows something about games and is probably not going to shame me for it. But one of the funny things for me as a Chinese historian is that I don't like a lot of popular culture. Like, I'm teaching a class this fall in anime and manga, and I don't actually particularly care for, like, I mean, anime is fine, manga is fine, like, but it's not one of my things, and my students are shocked. They're like, but why are you teaching a class if you don't, like, really like it? And I'm like, well, you know, here's the thing. Especially at my university, the Japanese historians and you know, people working in literature and other fields like have this huge opportunity because we have these students that are just like totally crazy for Japan anything. So they'll take any class with like Japan in the title, whereas I don't have students that are like, I'm super crazy about Romance of the Three Kingdoms, you know? And I really kind of wish I did have students that, like, again, not that I really know anything about Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but I could probably be like, you think Romance of the Three Kingdoms is cool? Let me introduce you to late Ming Dynasty 20, you know, like supernatural literature. We'll have some real fun. So it's cool. Like, I like the idea of this being explicitly Three Kingdoms and Chinese Three Kingdoms, and like, I like that idea of that going to a Western audience, because I do feel like most people who play games or consume, you know, different kinds of media like anime or manga have probably been introduced to Three Kingdoms stuff. They just don't know it.
Right.
And this is explicit. It literally is like Total War. Three Kingdoms, like,
yes.
So yes,
as opposed to, you know, Total War Oriental Adventures or something, which, you know, no, but like seriously, 25 years ago, they might have done that, you know.
Yes.
And now there's this,
no, that's,
you know.
very true.
Well, listen, Maggie, this has been great. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. This has been delightful.
And thanks everybody for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. Please consider visiting us at historyrespawn.com, which will also have links to our video episodes as well as podcast episodes. And if you like this work and would like to support it and help us to do more, please do consider visiting patreon.com/historyrespawn to offer support. Thanks very much and goodbye.